In 2007, a UBS private banker named Bradley Birkenfeld walked into the United States Department of Justice and handed over a list. 4,500 names. American clients, all hiding money in Switzerland. What Birkenfeld did was illegal under Swiss law. Disclosing client information to a foreign government, any foreign government, for any reason, had been a criminal offense in Switzerland since 1934. The penalty was prison. He knew that going in. He went to prison. 3 years. And then, in 2012, the IRS handed him a check for $104 million, the largest whistleblower award in IRS history. But the story of why that law existed, why Switzerland made banking secrecy a criminal offense, why the world's wealthiest people trusted a landlocked country of 9 million with their most sensitive money, and what that system was actually built on, is what almost nobody explains. That is what this video is about. And by the end of it, you will understand exactly why Switzerland became the world's banker, what it costs the rest of the world, and whether the system that built it is truly gone. To understand why the world parks its money in Switzerland, you need to understand one thing that Switzerland has been doing for longer than most modern states have existed: staying out of other people's wars. Because that one policy decision, made and sustained across centuries, is the foundation that everything else was built on. If you miss it, the banking dominance makes no sense. In 1713, the Great Council of Geneva passed a law making it illegal for bankers to disclose information about their clients to foreign governments. This was not a financial innovation. It was a political one. Geneva's private banks were already managing money for European aristocrats and French nobility. Those clients needed to know their assets were protected from the prying eyes of foreign crowns. The Geneva Law gave them that guarantee in writing. Then, in 1815, the Congress of Vienna formally recognized Switzerland's perpetual neutrality. Every major European power, Austria, Prussia, Russia, France, Britain, signed a document confirming that Switzerland would not take sides in their conflicts. In exchange, Switzerland would remain a buffer zone between competing powers. The practical consequence for banking was immediate and lasting. If you were a European aristocrat, a merchant, a landowner in a country that might be invaded, occupied, or restructured by the next war, and there was always a next war, Switzerland was the only place in Europe where your money was guaranteed to remain beyond reach. Not because of military strength, because of a legal and political status that the most powerful countries on the continent had agreed to honor. Capital flowed in. From France before the Revolution, from Germany and Austria-Hungary through the tumult of the 19th century, from Russia as the Tsarist regime wobbled. Swiss private banks, most of them family-run partnerships in Geneva, Basel, and Zurich, built multi-currency accounts, custodial services, and portfolio management for wealthy foreigners across 3 centuries of European upheaval. By the early 20th century, Swiss banks were already the preferred custodians for the private wealth of Europe's elite. The secrecy was customary, professional, and backed by legal precedent stretching back 2 centuries. What came next turned custom into law, and law into a fortress. The informal secrecy that Swiss banks had practiced for 200 years was powerful. But informal can be pressured, and in the early 1930s, Switzerland came under serious pressure from France, from Germany, from governments that wanted to know where their citizens' money had gone. What came out of that pressure was a piece of legislation that transformed Swiss banking from a cultural practice into an almost impenetrable legal structure. And if you want to understand how $9 trillion ended up managed in a country of 9 million people, this law is the reason. The Federal Act on Banks and Savings Banks, the Banking Law of 1934, did something no country had done before. It made disclosing client information a criminal offense, not a civil matter, not a regulatory breach, a crime, punishable by prison and fines. Article 47 was specific. Any bank employee who revealed client details to a third party, including a foreign government, could face up to 3 years in jail. The official reason for the law was to stabilize a Swiss banking system shaken by the global banking crisis of the early 1930s. That was part of it, but historians have long noted a second function. The law arrived precisely as Nazi Germany was beginning to pressure Swiss banks to reveal which German citizens had assets across the border. The Secrecy statute made it legally impossible for Swiss banks to comply, even if they had wanted to. The effect was instantaneous. Money poured in from across Europe. Jewish families and political dissidents moving assets beyond the Nazis' reach. European industrialists protecting capital from unstable governments. And eventually, from every corner of the globe, anyone with a reason to keep their financial affairs out of sight. By the end of World War II, Switzerland managed an estimated 40% of all European private wealth that had fled the continent's wars and political instability. The 1934 law had done what 200 years of custom had not quite managed. It gave foreign depositors an absolute legal guarantee. Swiss banks held and kept your secrets, not out of courtesy, out of statute. The 1934 law was built, in part, to protect people from the Nazis. That is the version of the story Swiss banking liked to tell. But the same law and the same system it created had a second history that runs in the opposite direction. And this is the part that most people who know about Swiss banking secrecy have never heard explained clearly. What did a system with no legal obligation to ask where money came from actually attract across the 7 decades when its secrecy was absolute? That is the question. And the answer changes how you understand every subsequent chapter of this story. If you find this kind of breakdown useful, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means the next video finds you automatically. Anyway, in 2022, a consortium of journalists obtained leaked records identifying more than 18,000 accounts at Credit Suisse alone. The Swiss Secrets investigation, led by the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung and the OCCRP, found accounts belonging to corrupt politicians, convicted criminals, arms dealers, and at least one intelligence operative. Clients included a Yemeni central bank governor, the son of a Pakistani intelligence chief, a Cambodian senator, and multiple individuals under international sanctions. This was not an aberration. Since 1934, banking secrecy laws had been violated in Switzerland by exactly 4 people: Christoph Meili in 1997, Bradley Birkenfeld in 2007, Rudolf Elmer in 2011, and Hervé Falciani in 2014. Each was prosecuted. Each faced criminal charges in Switzerland. The law that made it a crime to share client information also made whistleblowing, in any form, functionally illegal. Journalists in Switzerland who possess leaked banking data can face espionage charges simply for holding it. And then there was the gold. Switzerland's central bank purchased over $400 million worth of gold from Nazi Germany during World War II, representing roughly 1/3 of the Reichsbank's total wartime gold sales. That gold included looted assets. It was melted down, re-stamped with neutral Swiss markings, and reintroduced into global circulation. The same system built to protect Jewish assets from the Nazis was simultaneously processing the proceeds of Nazi confiscation. The secrecy law worked exactly as designed. It kept secrets. Whose secrets it kept depended entirely on who had the money to deposit. The law made no distinction between a Jewish family fleeing the Nazis and the proceeds of Nazi looting. Both were equally protected. That was, and remained, its defining feature for 70 years. By 2007, Swiss banking secrecy had survived 2 world wars, the Cold War, multiple international pressure campaigns, and the rise of global financial regulation. It had never been seriously breached. Then, Bradley Birkenfeld walked into the Department of Justice, and within a decade, the absolute secrecy that had defined Swiss banking for 73 years was functionally over. How that happened, and why it matters for understanding what Switzerland actually is today, is what this chapter is about. Birkenfeld's disclosure triggered a federal investigation into UBS. U.S. prosecutors established that the bank had been helping American clients hide assets using encrypted laptops, coded communications, and shell companies. In 2009, UBS agreed to pay $780 million in fines and penalties, and, crucially, to hand over the account details of approximately 4,450 American clients to the IRS. The Swiss government faced a constitutional crisis. Complying with the U.S. demand required Parliament to pass emergency legislation overriding the 1934 banking secrecy law. It did. That was the beginning of the end of absolute secrecy. In 2010, the U.S. Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, required Swiss banks to report information on American account holders or face a 30% withholding tax on all U.S.-sourced income. Switzerland signed. In 2017, Switzerland began automatically exchanging financial account information with other governments under the OECD's Common Reporting Standard. Article 47, the Criminal Secrecy Statute of 1934, was not repealed. But the system it had protected was methodically dismantled through international treaty. Then came Credit Suisse. Already weakened by years of scandal, the Mozambique tuna bonds affair, the Archegos and Greensill collapses, and the Swiss secrets investigation, Credit Suisse suffered a bank run in early 2023 following the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank in the U.S. In March 2023, the Swiss government orchestrated an emergency weekend rescue. UBS acquired its only major domestic competitor for $3.25 billion, a fraction of Credit Suisse's former value. Switzerland's second-largest bank ceased to exist. Swiss banking secrecy, in its absolute 1934 form, was finished. The 4 people who had breached it across 70 years were vindicated by events. The system they had exposed had cost Swiss banks more than $6 billion in combined fines, and had destroyed one of the 2 institutions at its center. The legal framework remained on the statute books. The practical reality it had created was gone. Here's what most of the coverage of Swiss banking's decline gets wrong. The secrecy is gone. The dominance is not. If you assumed that the end of banking secrecy would mean the end of Switzerland as the world's banker, you would be looking at the wrong thing. What Switzerland built over 3 centuries was not just a legal framework. It was an infrastructure. And that infrastructure survived everything that was thrown at it. Swiss banks managed 9.284 trillion Swiss francs in assets at the end of 2024. That is not a typo. 9,284 billion Swiss francs. For a country with a GDP of roughly 800 billion Swiss francs, Its banking sector manages assets worth more than 11 times the entire national economy. In the United States, the equivalent ratio is approximately 1 to 1. The Swiss Bankers Association estimated that Swiss banks held $6.5 trillion of the world's total cross-border assets, roughly 25% of all offshore wealth on Earth. The runner-up, Hong Kong, holds less than half that figure. After the Credit Suisse acquisition, UBS alone manages over $5 trillion in assets under management. Goldman Sachs manages approximately $2.8 trillion. The reason the money stayed, even after secrecy ended, is that secrecy was never the only reason it came. Political neutrality still holds. The Swiss franc still strengthens in a crisis, making it a genuine safe haven currency. Swiss courts still enforce contracts reliably. The Swiss National Bank maintains one of the most disciplined inflation records in the developed world. And 3 centuries of accumulated expertise in multi-currency wealth management, trust structures, and cross-border portfolio construction cannot be replicated by a competitor who simply lowers their tax rate. The Secrecy Law of 1934 was a weapon. It attracted capital during the years when hiding money was legal, lucrative, and in some cases genuinely necessary. When that weapon was taken away, by international pressure, by whistleblowers, by American prosecutors with more leverage than any European government had managed, what remained was 300 years of structural advantage that no treaty could dismantle. Switzerland did not survive the end of banking secrecy. Switzerland was already something else by the time secrecy ended. Bradley Birkenfeld collected his $104 million and wrote a book. The law that made his disclosure a crime was still on the statute books. Swiss banks still manage more of the world's private wealth than any other country. The clients whose names he handed over paid their back taxes and kept their accounts. Switzerland built a banking system on 3 things: political neutrality that made it the safest address in Europe, a legal framework that made client secrecy a criminal protection, and 3 centuries of expertise that made it irreplaceable. 2 of those 3 things remain fully intact. The third is gone, and the system survived anyway. The world's banker is still open for business. The terms have changed. The address has not. Switzerland became the world's banker by staying out of wars for 500 years and writing one law in 1934. But there is a country that built something comparable in financial power. In 20 years, from nothing, with no centuries of neutrality and no inherited infrastructure. In 2010, Qatar bought Harrods. The most famous department store in Britain sold for £1.5 billion to a country most of the people shopping there that morning could not have found on a map. That was just a Tuesday. Right now, without knowing it, there is a reasonable chance that your supermarket, your airport, the bank that holds your savings, and the football club you watch on Saturday are all, at least partially, owned by a country of 300,000 citizens on a strip of desert in the Persian Gulf. That video will show you exactly how a country that had nothing, no neutrality, no centuries of banking tradition, no inherited infrastructure, built one of the most powerful financial weapons on Earth in a single generation, and what it is quietly using that weapon to buy. It is on this channel right now. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.